Welcome to Asia Undercurrent Season 4. This is Session 20. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. I am your moderator for today's webinar. Thank you very much for coming. This Session 20 is about space. The title of this webinar is Space, the Next Frontier, the New Era of Development, Competition, and Cooperation. The space is now being in many challenges, and there's a lot of dynamics, and I think it is an excellent subject to discuss for today's Asia Undercurrent, and also the changes of the global landscape. For this webinar, I have invited our excellent panelists from different continents. We have Raji Rajagopalan from India. She's a director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And also Victoria Samson. She's a chief director of Space Security and Sustainability for the Secure World Foundation. And last but not least, Mr. Nobu Okada, who is a founder and CEO of the Astroscale Holdings. His company has just listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange market, and I think congratulations for that. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. I'm working as a professor of the University of Tokyo, but also I am working on the space businesses or space policy issues, and I'm a member of the National Space Policy Committee. So I am very much excited about this opportunity to discuss the new dynamics of space today. For many of the listeners and the viewers who have images of the space, it's most likely having the image of space competition between the United States and Soviet Union, and which eventually leads to the Apollo moon landing, development of space shuttle and the space station, and there were a lot of evolution and advancement of the technology and lots of contribution on the humanities. But at the same time, I think in the last decades, there are a lot of changes in space. One of which is what I call democratization of space, which means that it is no longer the elite countries like United States or Russia or China, Japan, India, and Europe, but also there are lots of countries from Global South to participate in the space activities. There are a lot of number of countries having the space agencies. I counted about more than 70 countries have space agencies, and more than 80 countries have their own satellites operating in orbit. And also there is a new dynamics of the commercialization or commercialization of space. Nobu, for example, is the person who is doing the space from the scratch as the space venture. And it's not Astroscale, but also there are a lot of new space commercial companies, including SpaceX by Mr. Elon Musk, or the Blue Origin by Mr. Jeff Bezos, and so many other commercial companies are operated and operated in space, which is creating a situation that space is more congested because there are a lot of companies are operating the satellites through the so-called constellations, which means that there are more than thousands of satellites synchronizing all together and provide services. So, for example, the Starlink, which is operated by the SpaceX, has more than 6,000 satellites altogether to provide one single service, the Starlink communication. So this commercialization is also creating a lot of dynamics of the competition as well as the cooperation. And I think one of the more interesting elements of the space is that the space is increasingly used for the military purposes. There are a lot of space services for communication, reconnaissance, and navigation, timing, and positioning. Also, these activities are changing the landscape of the battlefield. For example, what happened between Russia and Ukraine, or the Azerbaijan and Armenia. There was the lots of drones were used, and these are supported by the space-based infrastructure. So role of space is very much important in the geopolitical competition, and also building those expensive infrastructure requires a lot of cooperation. But because of the congestion in the orbit, and also because of the vulnerability of the space systems, which are not being able to hide from anything, it will be very much of the problem for how to protect the space system, how to ensure the continuous services for the commercial services as well as the military services. And this will be also very much of the important discussion for the global governance. So how to set up the rules at the international level, and how to maintain the order in orbit is going to be very much of the subject of the day. So I am very much happy to invite all the panelists to discuss about these important issues. Raji from security, and also from the Global South side. Victoria has a long-standing experience on the building the system for the global governance and setting up rules, and Nobu for discussing from the commercial practitioner perspective. So I'll give the floor to Raji for the first opening remarks. Raji, floor is yours.
Thank you, Kazuto. It's great to be a part of this conversation. And I can pick on each of the points that you highlighted, and we could have a webinar on that. There is so much that is happening in space. To start off, space has become such an inalienable part of our lives today, whether it is using GPS for seeking directions, or for seamless communication, or predicting weather, or of course for military purpose, and so on and so forth. But the threat to space is increasingly those relating to military and security, and I think the implications go beyond the security sector. It is going to impact upon the development and communication and several other sectors. Also, given the kind of globalization of technologies that we see and space-based services, the implications or impact of any disruption in space-based activities is going to be felt across multiple regions. Some of these threats at least are not new, and these have existed in the past, especially between the US and the Soviet Union. But there is a key difference in terms of the current circumstances, which appear to be quite different from the past. Countries are today demonstrating greater willingness as well as motivation to develop and use counter-space weapons that could threaten the common use of outer space, as well as to deny adversaries any benefit they can gain from the use of space assets. And I think this sense of competition primarily between US and China today, but I think it goes beyond that. Maybe it is an initial set of competition began there, but it has spread to other countries as well. So the rivalry among all the major space players have also created a certain amount of suspicions, even when states are engaged in technological developments that are purely for peaceful purposes, such as satellite inspection, refueling, repair, or broadly called the on-orbit satelliting service technologies, or technologies that are being developed to clean up space junk. There's huge amount of space debris floating around. So how do we develop these technologies and put them into use in a way that is going to be appealing to everybody, that is going to be comfortable to other players, and so on and so forth? for all the rhetoric and formal declaratory statements that states make, all the major space players today are developing military aspects to their space programs. From the perspectives of these countries that are developing such military space capabilities, they believe that an inaction will leave them vulnerable and unprotected. So there is, therefore, a constant effort to stay competitive, achieve some sort of parity with their potential adversaries. And therefore, there is a growth of counter space capabilities, which has become a big issue, but also it's a major challenge that needs to be addressed. This is particularly the case among the big three players in the space domain, the US, China, and Russia. In fact, what China does in counter space tech development, for instance, the anti-satellite tests in January 2007, it did produce a much larger impact in a sense. It did produce a cascading effect with India, Japan, the US, and others following suit in a sense. In fact, China's anti-satellite test in 2007 led to a global return to ASAT testing after a gap of, there was an unwritten moratorium in place for about 2 decades, but that was broken by China in 2007 with its ASAT test in January 2007. And thereafter, now you are seeing a return to ASAT testing as something that is beginning to kind of figure prominently. 2008, the US did its mission Operation Burnt Frost and its return to ASAT. And of course, India conducted its own ASAT test in March 2019. Along with this, there is a growth of other counter space threats, making space a lot more competitive, contested, but also extremely fragile than before. And I think along with the proliferation of counter space capabilities, there is also the other aspect of the development of military specific space institution. Again, that needs to be addressed. India's ASAT test in 2019 is a case in point, but there are other investing in such capabilities, but also there are many more countries developing defense space strategies, putting in place defense space institutions and so on and so forth, in order to bring about better coordination within their own governments in ensuring optimal use of space by armed forces. Space was, of course, part of the intense political competition between the two superpowers during the Cold War, but the use of space was restricted to the strategic operations such as nuclear weapon surveillance, early warning systems, and so on and so forth. But today, you do see a much more permeated role for space in conventional military operations. And the consequence of counter space use will vary depending on the kind of counter space capabilities that may be used. All of this brings me to the final point on the importance of global governance from a space security perspective. Developing consensus among major powers has remained a major stumbling block due to the contested nature of great power relations. Within this, I would say a technology focus is important, and therefore to see what kind of technologies are being developed. But I think we need to go beyond and look at the kind of behavior that are threatening and that needs to be avoided. Also, I would add that one needs to evolve a consequence-based approach, which will look at the consequences of an action rather than the technology that is being employed. In fact, this is one step beyond a behavior-based approach that can be particularly helpful if a state has to call for penalty based on the damage or destruction. Finally, we have to consider the role of deterrence in space, which in my view, by and large, holds up the peace in space currently, but also it leads to increase in competition towards this technology development that can further aggravate the competition, suspicion, and concerns, and so on and so forth. Let me stop here, and I look forward to more questions and comments. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Raji, for excellent remark. So I'll now pass the microphone to Victoria.
Thank you, Kazuto-san, and thank you to Asia Undercurrent for having me here tonight. So my organization, the Secure World Foundation, focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. And we promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. So in watching this space, no pun intended, for some while, and I'd like to start off by saying we are 5 years into the biggest change since the beginning of the space age, and that is the rise of the very large constellations. And just to contextualize, how big of an impact this and how different it is. Right now, Japan has about 115 active satellites. India has 68. The United States has about 7,200. And this is out of a total of 10,250 active satellites. Of those 10,250 active satellites, as Kazuto said, SpaceX's Starlink has almost 6,100. So it's a huge change. in terms of percentage, in terms of actors. And what we're seeing is, one of the biggest primary actors in space is no longer a nation state. It's the commercial sector. And SpaceX is only the first very large, or Starlink is the only first very large constellation. There are plans for, it's hard to say, every single month, I think a new very large constellation gets planned, but we're looking at tens of thousands, even possibly hundreds of thousands more satellites. And so that's going to be a huge shift. I mean, that's a key change for governance. And it's upended years of established best practices in ways that are both helpful to space sustainability, but also a challenge to it. It's helpful in terms of these very large constellations. They have end of lives that are very quick. Right now, the best practice is at 25 years after your satellite reaches its end of life to dispose of it in some way, shape, or form. All these very large constellations, they're down to single digits in terms of maybe 5 years or less, which is great. I mean, again, from a sustainability perspective, it's getting rid of cluttered environment, or at least helping make it less cluttered. There's some establishment of right-of-way practices, which is usually has not been the case. Space is big, and pretty much before this all happened, satellites had plenty of room to maneuver. But these orbits, particularly low Earth orbit, which is anywhere from about 100 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers, is getting increasingly congested, largely due to this. And again, just to say, I think oftentimes these very large constellations get criticized for the complications they bring, but they are bringing satellite to parts of the world and to people that never had it before. And they're bringing benefit to humanity, and so that's why we need to discuss it. But as I said, there's also challenges to them as well. There's challenges in terms of spectrum allocation. Your satellite's only as good if you can get communications to or from it, and there's a lot of ask for spectrum. There's a challenge to space traffic management issues. There's a challenge just for the idea of space situational awareness. These satellites are released in chunks of 20, 30 satellites at a time. It's complicated to be able to track. And then there's concern about, are they filling up the carrying capacity of certain orbits? If you have tens of thousands of satellites in a certain orbit, has that orbit gotten full, so to speak? We don't think so, but we're still at the early stages for discussing that sort of thing. And then another thing that they're to look at, and I think we're really at the beginning of stages of this, but are there possible environmental effects from these very large constellations, both in going up and coming back down? Is the rapid launch, are those launches putting chemicals in the Earth's atmosphere? When these satellites come back down and burn up in the Earth's atmosphere, are the metals that they're releasing affecting the Earth's atmosphere? We don't know. We're at the very early stages of that, but there could be complications. And as well, with increased dependence on space capabilities, we're also seeing interest in and efforts to develop counter space capabilities, and that's proliferated. Raji went over that in great detail, but I will point out the organization, the Secure World Foundation, does an annual global counter space threat assessment where we use open source information to examine counter space capabilities from around the world. I'm the co-editor of it. We have it available in English on our website, but it's translated into all 61 languages, plus Japanese and Portuguese for the executive summary. But I mean, just kind of the big picture, there's a whole lot of research and development and even operationalizing a variety of counter space capabilities. And there's research and development into looking at destructive counter space capabilities. But as of right now, there are no destructive counter space capabilities being used in active military conflicts. I will point out there's efforts to handle these threats. There are discussions at the United Nations about norms, rules, and principles of behavior, responsible behavior in space, with the idea that just the dual nature of a lot of these space technologies, it's hard to say, well, we'll just ban weapons. Well, what's a weapon? How do you define it? As Raji pointed out, often satellites that are used to remove debris can also be used to interfere with another country's satellite. So it's more helpful to look at, how can we look at what are the patterns of life, and how do we determine what's threatening and what's not threatening? I will also point out there's unilateral efforts. The United States in April 2022 announced it was committing not to conduct this destructive anti-satellite missile tests. It has since Japan made this commitment in September of 2022. 37 countries total have done that. And as you can see, there's a norm emerging that it's considered irresponsible to deliberately create debris on orbit. So this is happening alongside big changes in civil space too. The International Space Station is one of the bedrocks, has been one of the bedrocks of civil space cooperation. I think maybe a lot of people who don't do space stations don't realize it has been in orbit. There have been human beings consistently in orbit since 2000. So we're going on 2.5 decades now. And that's huge. It's been a great bit of space diplomacy. It's built specifically so that the US side, which is US, Japan, Canada, Europe, Britain, has to work with the Russian side. And that was done intentionally. But the International Space Station is coming to the end of its life. Best case scenario, it's going to go until 2030 or so. And at that point, there's no room for Russia in space stations. NASA is looking at commercial space stations. I don't think Russia will be involved in that. And so the concern is, well, how do we incorporate that, or how do we work in diplomatic outreach? There was a reason why it was done in 2000. I think that reason is still valid. And even now, the Chinese space station is still active. And this complication is all happening while more and more countries are attempting to get to the moon and conduct activities there. Right now, about 20 countries have plans to do something on the moon in the next decade or so. And that's huge. And so the concern is, do our current governance mechanisms, are they up to the task? It's been a big change when you only had, 1 or 2 actors. Even now, there's only been 5 countries that have gone to the moon. So that's going to be a huge change. And then you have commercial actors going to the moon. It's not just civil space agencies. And the concern I have is, are we going to see the complications in space on Earth being replicated in the moon? And we're looking at, are there competing or complementary governance models being set? The United States has been promoting the Artemis Accords, which is a set of principles for lunar activities that was first announced in October of 2020, and Japan was one of the initial signers. And now there's India signed in August 2023. Right now, there are 43 countries that have signed it. And the idea is just building upon the principles of the Outer Space Treaty, and also addressing transparency, interoperability, working together with science, data, research utilization, and things of that nature. But then on the other hand, we have the International Lunar Research Station, announced by China and Russia in June of 2021. It has 11 signatories. And while they've announced the scientific cooperation for that, they haven't talked about their principles for that. And the concern I have is, are they going to be similar to Artemis Accords? Probably. I mean, they're working with the same laws of astrodynamics. China and Russia both signed the Outer Space Treaty, but we don't know for sure. And so I'm hoping that they'll learn to work together on these issues. I will point out the Artemis Accords is an excellent first step to promote a cooperative, peaceful use of the moon and celestial bodies. And hopefully we'll continue to see a collaborative mindset among space actors, so we can continue to get the benefits in space over the long term. And before I stop, I will point out that there's room for civil society in these discussions. And maybe I'm a little biased because my organization is a nonprofit, but we like to think that there's a place to have these discussions outside of the formal United Nations institutions. And so one thing that we're doing is next month, July 11th and 12th, Secure World Foundation is hosting our Summit for Space Sustainability with the Japanese Cabinet Office, with a goal of having discussions for the Asia Pacific flavor of all the issues we've discussed there. So with that, I'll stop my commercial. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for the intervention. And I will be also coming to the summit in July in Tokyo, so looking forward to it. By the way, I forgot to mention that those who are watching this webinar, please, and if you are watching on the Nikkei channel or YouTube live, then and have not submitted a question when registering, please scroll down to find a link to submit your Q&A. We encourage you to put your country and affiliation to your question. Please do so while we are talking. We're happy to take your questions. So next up, I would like to pass the microphone to Nobu for your first statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazuto, and then Prime Minister Office and Nikkei for inviting me on this critical dialogue on the competition and the cooperation in space. We are a commercial company, and we play game without state affiliation, but understanding and addressing the challenge of the maintaining peaceful space development during the increasing geopolitical sensitivity and industry competition is very important. Let me briefly talk about Astroscale first. Our mission is to ensure a safe and sustainable development of space. 11 years ago, as Kazuto mentioned, I had nothing to do with the space industry, but I realized space debris had already made the space environment unsustainable, and no one had a solution for the problem. So I started Astroscale because removing space debris was not only a business opportunity, but also an environmental necessity. But at the beginning, not many people supported our mission. People said it would be impossible to develop technologies, influence policy, and make a successful business case. But today is different. We are proving rendezvous and docking technologies and approach and capture technologies in space and making revenue from debris removal, inspection, and refueling. And one of our satellites in space approached to the 3-ton, 11-meter size gigantic debris from the ground, and now it's just 15 meters behind it. And last week we publicized the world's first space debris image and time-lapse movie, of the real debris. And then it was garbage, but it was just beautiful. And now we are at the cusp of the booming on-orbit servicing, or OOS market, that is projected to generate $18 billion in revenue in the next decade. Talking about the competitions, 10 years ago, there's no competitor. 5 years ago, couple. 1 year ago, around 30 companies are entering the on-orbit servicing market, but today more than 100. So you can understand how rapidly, competition occurs in this democratized, circumstances. As Raji and Victoria mentioned, space is just one single domain. There's no border, and civil, commercial, and defense are all sharing one single domain. So we have to have a collaboration, cooperation. But the biggest issue in space is that risk is increasing, return is decreasing. So we have to flip this. So what's happening right now is private money and public money are invested in the space industry, and people expect healthy competition, lowering the cost, and more better application happens in space, and investors get a return, and then more money flows in the space industry. So we are expecting this kind of a good cycle, but what's happening right now is due to the increase of the number of satellites and number of debris, and over the last several years, it increased a lot. And by 2030, space environment will be more congested, and just the environment situation is intensifying every day. So we are on the verge. So Astroscale are making haste. We are developing technologies and advancing technologies so that we can become a kind of a infrastructure in space as a kind of a road service on the orbital highway, like towing the debris, refueling the kind of satellites which run out of fuel. So to make space operation sustainable. So let me pause here and turn back to Kazuto-san.
Right. Thank you very much for your for explaining what's going on in orbit, and I think this is a very interesting time that these kind of the roadside services are now being done at the commercial level, not as a public affairs, and I would get into that later. So thank you very much for three of you to make your first remarks. I'd like to pick up a couple points from your discussion. First, Raji, I think it was very interesting to hear from your thoughts about the penalty system based on the damages, and well, given the situation where it is getting more and more difficult And I think Victoria has mentioned about the unilateral approach, unilateral declaration of the, the banning, the ASAT test, and so on and so forth. How could this penalty system will be accepted as the international norm or international rules? What's the pathway to make it as internationally recognized principle?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to take it forward in a sense in terms of a global governance conversations or new rules of the road when we think about the space security developments in particular. And I think the behavioral approach itself is a good step forward, and there has been reasonable amount of agreement. I was part of the GG in 2018, 2019 on PAROS, and I did see the kind of conversation that happened among the 25 countries in terms of there is broad sort of consensus in terms of saying that we cannot rely on technology because any technology in space can be used in a nefarious fashion. So how do you, so technologies cannot be, there's no point in denying or sort of saying that banning technologies is not really a way. And therefore, look at the behavioral kind of approach, what kind of behavior are threatening, and therefore look at that as a sort of a baseline, so to say. But my point is that irrespective of the behavior or irrespective of the kind of technology that is being used, if we can look at what can be the consequence, what is the consequence of a particular action, particular sort of a deployment of a system or things of that kind. And that penalty, it's not, again, I'm not saying that this is going to be easy because it's going to be, it took several years in terms of developing that bit of consensus for states to move away from defining space weapon, defining technologically, to come to the fact, to come to a common understanding that behavior may be a better benchmark than technology. So I'm not going to say that this is going to be an easy thing. And today, states, all the major players do understand the challenges. It's not because the states do not understand the challenges that we are unable to form new rules of the road. It is because of the political issues that have come into play. The political issues have become bigger hurdles than many of the space security challenges. So if you're able to build consensus among the major powers to start off, I think that itself can be. So this is going to be a long way off. I think we need to have, and I think in some sense, what we are seeing today is such a fractured global politics. The conversation, there are multiple parallel processes, the number of OEWGs, open-ended working groups, or the number of GGs, the group of UN group of governmental experts that have been formulated in the last few years. It is crazy. We don't need more and more mechanisms, but if we can actually get the major players to talk about this issue. But again, I need to go beyond the major players because in the 60s and 70s, it was relatively easier when the US and the Soviets could sit together and decide what is best for the rest of the world, so to say. EU tried that process by bringing in the International Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities. And many countries around the world, including India and a whole lot of other countries, said, who is this EU to decide what is good for the rest of the world? We need to have a say. And so given that every developing country, whether they have a space power, space launching capability or not, they are dependent on space. Therefore, they also want to have a say in how the space is going to be governed, what rules are going to be written. In addition, you have commercial players. How do you bring them into the room to talk about standards, to talk about best practices? So it's gotten way more complicated than what it was like in the 60s and 70s. It's not going to be an easy process. And it is the geopolitics. It is essentially the lack of consensus among major powers to decide what is a primary challenge in space. How do you work around building various solutions? And in that sense, I would say we need to start with smaller technical agreements instead of going for large treaties that would deal with ASAT weapons, that would deal with cybersecurity in space, that would deal with space debris, arms race. You cannot have one overarching treaty that is going to cover all your different threats and challenges, because that has become a lot more. It is going to be that much more difficult to develop that consensus involving all the space players, which means maybe you develop smaller technical agreements, maybe even go for minilateral approaches, in fact, I think the UN ODA, Human Office of Disarmament Affairs, talked about how you could have multiple sort of these kind of minilaterals coming together to find larger consensus and so on and so forth. So if you have multiple minilateral groupings, forming smaller technical agreements, developing consensus within these groupings, and then integrate them into a larger consensus, maybe you can take it to a larger UN or other multilateral or regional platform at a later stage. But my own sense is that we need to start with smaller technical agreements, and so that can involve a consequence-based approach from moving away from a purely sort of a behavioral approach. And I would also stress the importance of political agreements, transparency and confidence building measures in the form of code of conduct, in the form of group of governmental experts. All of these are essentially meant to create better trust in each other, promoting mutual trust, encouraging cooperation, openness, while possibly reducing some tensions and misperceptions. Because today, you don't know what your adversary is possibly developing, and therefore that is giving way to more sort of suspicion and so on and so forth. So if you want to work on some of those issues, I think that is looking at various political agreements, TCBMs, transparency and confidence building measures can be sort of a good way to go about. So maybe developing various code of conduct involving all the major players, or sort of other political agreements. And I think with these voluntary commitments and these kind of political agreements, I agree there is a large number of countries who do not see the value of such kind of agreements as against legally binding sort of instruments in a sense. But I think it's also going to be a lot more easier to develop these political agreements, because I think these are voluntary commitments, somewhat less complemented in terms of what needs to be enforced, what needs to be verified. There are no extended technical decisions because these are political commitments. But at the same time, the disadvantages are that these are declaratory statements. So what is the efficacy of this? What if somebody breaks out their commitment, walk out of there, violates the commitments and so on and so forth? It could be broken with no penalties and so on and so forth. And again, with no verification mechanism, how do we know countries are not breaking commitments? Again, verification in space, I think that's a $1 million challenge that we are talking about. Those who have been in this business know how challenging that is. So again, developing a consequence-based approach is not going to be easy, but I think we need to take small steps, maybe in the form of minilateral grouping. Squad itself, I think it's a good place. We can have quad, squad. There are so many different formulations. It's an alphabetic soup when it comes to the Indo-Pacific for sure, but beyond as well. And I think we need to develop these smaller agreements, consensus in the smaller groupings first, before you take it to a larger regional grouping.
Right.
Kazuto, I'd like to build upon what Raji was saying. I mean,
Yeah,
she's 100% right. It's a real challenge. And it takes a while to build consensus, and that's a feature of international diplomacy. That's not a bug. I will point out that the part of the United Nations that deals with civil space issues, the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, spent the better part of a decade just recently discussing long-term sustainability guidelines. And eventually, after 9 years or 7 years, many years of negotiation, they were finally able to come to consensus, and they agreed on 21 guidelines. This happened in 2019. And, again, this is at that point, the COPUOS had 92 members, include countries like the United States, India, Japan, Russia, China, Iran, like a variety of space actors. And so it is possible. It's not impossible, I should say. It is more complicated, though. And one thing I'll also point out as well is that, these discussions at the United Nations on, norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior, I think it's been very eye-opening in terms of a lot of countries, as Raji said, have realized that space is incredibly relevant to them. Every single person on this planet is a user of space data in some way, shape, or form. So they have an incentive to ensure that the access to and use of that data is not interrupted. So I think that's been a big change. But also, I will point out, there's nothing keeping these countries from going home and nationalizing the best practices and the norms and rules of responsible behavior they talk about in the multilateral level. These agreements are only successful if they're actually implemented. And so I think, that's something to point to. If you can have discussions at the international level and maybe not reach 100% consensus, but you see commonalities emerge and countries go back to their capitals and then start enacting regulations that promote those responsible behaviors, I think we can see improvement. So it's going to be baby steps, but I think there's definitely a possibility for ensuring that space is stable, predictable for all. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that forthcoming sort of a, not looking at the bright side of a story. Just picking up of what Raji has mentioned about the minilateral, I think one of interesting subject to discuss is to set up the rules on the moon exploration. And I think on the one hand, the United States is now, expanding the membership of those countries which are signed on to the Artemis Accord, which is now 43 countries. And this is since the moon is a sort of a wild west. I mean, there's no rules to govern the how to explore moons, and apart from Outer Space Treaty saying that no national appropriation, no military use, but other than that, there is no rules. So I think Artemis Accord is providing the rules, but it is still, let's say, Western agreement, whereas the China and Russia are now playing. I mean, they are planning to build the Lunar research station, and this is going to be also attracting, some countries like Venezuela, etc. So, what would be the sort of I mean, this is a test case of the Raji's mention about building a minilateral and merging them together. Do you see that the possibility for setting up the global rules? I'll ask Victoria first, and then I would ask Raji then.
Sure, Kazuto. I mean, I think there definitely is room for that. I will point out the Artemis Accords are largely built on principles that are in the Outer Space Treaty, which many countries signed, not just Western countries. And if you're looking at countries that have actually signed on the Artemis Accords, it's not just Western countries. There's countries from all over the world that have signed it. So I think there's a possibility for that. But I think there's a lot we don't know. Things are different on the moon. Shocking. Not just gravity, but I mean, the lunar orbits are a lot different. Dust on the moon is different. You have to really worry about dust plumes getting over, from launch sites and affecting other efforts. So, I mean, I think that, it's almost a way we understand the principles, but how do you apply those principles? And so I think it is helpful to have conversations at the international level just to understand, okay, what do you want to do? What are you planning on doing? And open, transparent discussions would really help with that conversation. But also complicating the fact is that there are commercial actors on the moon. And again, that is a huge shift, as I said before, from civil space actors. Officially under the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6, countries have they're required to authorize and do continuing supervision of their national actors. So, it's not like the commercial actors can do whatever they want, but then it comes down to what does that actually mean? I will point out earlier this year, there was a bunch of news stories about a commercial company, a US commercial company, going to the moon, and they were going to bring cremated human remains. And some people were very upset about that. But there's actually no US agency that could actually say, no, you're not allowed to do that. There's because it's a commercial actor. NASA regulates what national, like US national government entities do, like civil entities. But in terms of like commercial payloads, there's nothing there yet. And so I'm always concerned, are we setting the precedent, the United States setting the precedent that if someone's willing to take your money, you can do whatever you want. I mean, we don't do that on Earth. Why would allow us to do it on the moon? But we're still at the early stages of trying to figure out, okay, what does this actually mean? And again, giving the authorization, at least within the government agencies, to be able to say, okay, you're the one that makes those kind of decisions. Right now, the United States hasn't figured that out yet.
Yeah, can I just build on some of the points that Victoria mentioned? And I think the fact that you have two sort of at a very initial stages, but in terms of Artemis Accords and the International Lunar Research Station, they're one under the leadership of the US and other under China and Russia. It's a classic sort of an example of the fractured politics, global politics that we see today. And I'm not sure the Artemis Accords have gained a little bit more numbers in terms of it's gaining more traction. And countries such as India moving on to signing the Artemis Accords is a big step. And then that can actually move many more developing countries also to look at the Artemis Accords in a bigger, with a changed perspective, because countries like India stood on the other side for a very long time, arguing for legally binding, verifiable mechanisms. So countries like India, if it is signing on to the Artemis Accords, then there is something the other countries would want to take a look and see, why is India changing its position? How is India moving towards the sort of a US-led initiative in that sense, and so on and so forth. One, of course, it's based on the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. So there are some core principles that on which this Artemis Accords is founded on. But I think beyond that also, it gives a lot more comfort to the developing countries in the global south, to feel that if India has signed on to something, then there is something India. Many times India has talked about its role as a bridge power kind of thing. I'm not a big fan of that term per se, but the fact is that India is positioning itself on some of these issues, global governance measures, can actually get the global South, developing world to think about, to have a rethink on their own policies and approaches in a sense. But and similar is the case of the Quad participation in space. In the last 4 or 5 years now, space is an integral part of the Quad conversations. The fact that the Quad leaders' statement talk about India, along with the other 3 countries, will consult on engage in consultations on developing new rules of the road, space issues, space security issues. That's a big change that in terms of India's position. For India, decades along, it was always wedded to the idea of you have to have a multilaterally framed, debated instrument, legally binding instrument that has to come from the CD if you're talking about space security issues, or the COPUOS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in Vienna, which is the venue for all the civil space actions. But for India to engage in a smaller exclusive grouping like the Quad and other minilaterals to talk about space security conversations, I think that's a big change that has come about, and that will create in a sense, change perspectives for a lot of other countries. One other point that came up multiple times is the private sector participation. This was predominantly seen as a sort of a Western phenomena, because Western countries have embraced private sector participation, commercial entities taking a big part in the space exploration. This was not the case for other major players, especially in the Asian context, for China, India, and so on and so forth. Japan has been a slightly more pro on this regard, but not so much for India and China. But that itself is changing. But the fact that the private sector players are not playing an independent role in these countries still kind of limit how much of an impact they can make, the private sector can make from these countries in global governance platforms is an issue. And therefore, countries like China, for instance, continue to talk about as to how the private sector cannot have such a dominant role when it comes to space security conversation, especially in venues like a Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. COPUOS is a slightly different issue, and how that is that COPUOS has approached the issue of private sector participation. But when it comes to space security developments, countries like China and Russia are extremely critical, even though China itself is becoming a much bigger player in terms of its private sector participation. But I think that's something it's going to take a while before it gains greater traction in terms of giving the private sector, commercial entities, a seat at the high table when it comes to global governance debates.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting that many of us, including India and Japan, are sort of moving on to change the conceptual images of space and space security, while China and Russia stick to the sort of an old-fashioned state-centric model. So I think this is making a sort of a difficulties of having a consensus on the basis of the regulations. Well, now I'd like to turn Nobu to discuss about the role of commercial space. I think Raji has just touched upon one of the issue that is for the space governance. I think one of the major points to eliminate the suspicion that Raji has mentioned is to improve the transparency, confidence building measures. And the transparency in confidence building measures is extremely important for the astroscale's activities, because the astroscale, which is capable of taking out the space debris, which is also being regarded as the capable companies to remove the someone's satellite, for example. It can be used as a sort of a space weapon technology. So how can you respond to that? How does it lead to the commercially successful operations without being suspicious or being attracting the suspicions?
Thank you, Kazuto, for the wonderful questions, because I'm at the airport right now to fly to the Vienna to talk at the United Nations exactly about what the topic what you said about transparency and safety of our technologies. So before answering your question, let me just echo what Raji and Victoria said. So the Outer Space Treaty plays crucial role in shaping rules related to the space activities, but it was not designed to address emerging challenges like private sector involvement and space debris. So given the increasing number of countries and companies engaged in space, new governance is necessary. And rather than creating a new treaty, a combination of soft rules such as best practices, norms, standards, alongside with enforceable domestic regulations would work. So hope these will emerge at the international level. And then, I just want to, for the audience, I would like to everyone be reminded that we private sectors need to be licensed by a state and meet safety requirement. And our operations are bound by respective domestic laws and regulations. And as Victoria said, it's not perfect system yet. But being a responsible actor and keeping space safe and sustainable is of genuine interest for commercial actors. And an unsustainable space environment is bad for business. So commercial sector need to be transparent about their activities and show their commitment for space sustainability through voluntary best practices and going above the regulatory minimums. So that's my thought. And answering the question, sorry for long answer. So yes, our technology, so every technology in space are dual use. Like Earth observation satellite is a spy satellite, and rocket is a missile. And our debris removal technology can be used for kinetic kind of a weapon in space. So that's why transparency and safety are so important. So let me tell you what exactly we are doing. We are quite open our mission, and we are kind of publicly telling what is our satellite and what's the client and where are we. And we are always doing the maneuver, and we are always providing our orbital data to the kind of global players, and so that they can track us anytime. And so we are quite transparent. So that's why suspicion doesn't happen to us. So, and also safety, we secure safety in spacecraft design, trajectory design, operations, and in the cybersecurity, whatever. And we are also making these public. So without these, in this kind of a competitive environment in space, just suspicion raises. So we have to avoid, we have to, commercial players be aware of the sensitivity of the new technologies. And that's answer. They come back to Kazuto.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, I think Raji has mentioned about difficulties of verification, but I think it is not just the verification, but it's a lack of transparency. And I think the Astroscale has committed to the transparency so that everyone can monitor and track whatever you said is right or wrong. That's another way of verification, and I think that is very useful. So thank you very much for the discussion. I think it's now time to move on to the questions from the audience. I've already got a couple questions already. So I like to ask one of those very interesting questions. So the first question is, what is the current and expected role of AI in technologies like quantum computing in space development and exploration? So what's the role of AI or space what's the role of AI in space development? Anyone wants to take up on it?
Let me go first. Actually, we are already using machine learning AI technology already. It's for ground testing, also simulations, and also we take lots of images in space, and then to processing the data, we use actually AI to understand the kind of the model, the client. So it's already kind of in use. That's the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Right, just building on that, you see it being used in terms of space situational awareness. There's a lot of objects in space, and there's a lot of potential conjunctions, close approaches. And so the idea of trying to figure out, okay, what's the pattern of life? What are we seeing? How do we determine what's actually going to be a dangerous close approach, as opposed to something that's not going to be something to worry about. And this is important because every time, if you get a notification, it's the US military actually is sending out these conjunction warnings to every single actor who's got a satellite in space, as a matter of basic spaceflight safety. If you get a notification about a potential close approach, you have to decide, okay, do I need to move my satellite or not? And every time you move your satellite, if you even have that capability, some satellites are non-maneuverable, which is a whole discussion there. But if you decide to move your satellite, you are using up fuel. And right now, you only have a certain amount of fuel. When it's done, you're done. Some companies and countries are working on on-orbit servicing, the idea of refueling. Northrop Grumman was able to do that a year or two back, but it's not really a common thing at this point. And so you don't want to maneuver your satellite more than you have to because you're unnecessarily shortening its life. But you also clearly don't want to crash into another satellite or piece of debris. So, that's where something like that, having some way to, sift through the massive amount of data and determine what's actually important to deal with and what you can ignore, that's going to be very helpful in the future. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Also, I would like that the role of AI can be used for the multiple way for the space-derived services. For example, the Earth observation data can be analyzed based on the AI, which can detect sort of a landslide or the potential for the flooding, etc. And also it can be used for the military purposes, like identifying the movement of our troops or things like that. Will be the AI will assist the analysis of the images of the Earth observation satellites. So that's another way of using AI for the international. Using AI for the space services. Right. So let's move to the next question. What does one need in terms of education or background to get involved in the space industry, research, policy, etc.? So this is quite probably from students, but I think I would ask Nobu for what's your recruitment recruitment standards?
Well, thanks for the questions. When I started Astroscale, I actually Googled how to develop satellite, and then actually there's no clear website for that. But today is different, yes, it's true. To do the business in space, there are multiple segments like engineer, policy, and or marketing, or whatever, finance and legal, and it's a bunch of areas you can learn. But I don't know what interest, but what I recommend you is to attend a couple of space conferences. Actually, you can attend, and you can access to a lot of papers, also people, and this actual space is super open to you. So it's a quite unique industry. And so from looking outside, it's closed, but when you get in there, it's open. So I suggest you to get there and see your interest.
Right. And I just want to build on that. I mean, you definitely, obviously, it's literally market science. So you do need to have, there are people that need engineers and scientists and physicists. But as Nobu-san said, I mean, you need policy folks too. My degree is a political science degree and focused on international relations. I have zero scientific training, but that's okay because you learn some stuff on the job. But also, a lot of what I do is look at the geopolitical consequences and discussions, and that's where it's helpful actually to have a political science degree. So I think oftentimes people think, okay, well, I want to work on space, but I'm not really good at science. You don't have to be. There's a whole world of opportunity there. Thanks.
Yeah.
Let me quickly just add a couple of points into this. Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, like Victoria, I come from completely from a policy background. I do not have a technical background. In fact, many times when I speak on these kind of platforms, I actually make the caveat that I'm not a technical person, but I look at things from a policy perspective. I understand technology to make sense of policy. And here, I think many a time, because I think each one of us are so dependent on space. If you want to be able to talk about essentially ensuring that space is going to be, we are going to be able to use space, access space in a continued, uninterrupted fashion. All of us have a responsibility. And I think civil society, think tank community, policy community, each one of us have. And I think some of these things, when you talk about even policy, we think, okay, this is something very sort of a foreign alien concept. I don't know what policy. It's actually basically very, very commonsensical things. To talk about, again, some of the examples that I gave, and I think Victoria may have heard me before talking about the same example, but that's the most kind of a best example that would provide a very good context. One is not throwing garbage in my neighbor's yard. I think that's a commonsensical thing. Again, when it comes to space, again, don't engage in activity that would create garbage in space. I think that's as simple as that. It is not, when you talk about responsible behavior in space, somehow we think that, oh my God, that's just something very, very, I don't even understand. This is something very convoluted. That is something that is being developed by a certain number of countries against the interest of other countries. No, these are very, very commonsensical principles. Not to tamper with the TV antenna of my neighbor. Again, very commonsensical thing. Again, translate to space, whether it is in terms of cyber interference in space activities, electronic interference, using lasers to dazzle, sort of a whole range of activities, counter space, the way things are being used. I think so. These are the kind of commonsensical principles we all in the policy world need to be focused on, not anything, and also talking about transparency and confidence building measures. These are things I think that increasingly it seems like we are most commonsensical principles, but need to be reiterated, need to be put in a sort of a codified in a document, so on and so forth, because states do seem to be forgetting that these are some basic essentials that we need to follow to keep space safe, secure, and sustainable in a sense.
Right. Thank you very much. By the way, I think none of us in this panel is coming from the space engineering or space sciences. I mean, I'm a political scientist as well as Raji and Victoria, and Nobu has a bachelor degree on the agriculture, I thought, but
agriculture.
Yeah, but you didn't spend too much time on the agriculture, and you move on to the space business. So I think we all have a different background without knowing anything about space, but ended up in the space business. So I think I think this variety of backgrounds makes a lot of interesting diversity and also flexibility to meet the challenges of today, because there are not the questions are not being able to solve only by the technology. I mean, we need to have a lawyer, we need to have a political scientist, we need to have a variety of people in marketing and sales. Those are also a background to work in the space. Okay, so the next question is that, can the Global South benefit in this journey? I think this new dynamics in space. Can Global South benefit from this new dynamics of space? I would ask Raji to go first.
Sure. Thanks. No, absolutely. Global South can benefit from the space journey. For that matter, the developing world in Asia, Africa, Latin America, all of these different regions have just begun to appreciate how much space can be used to change the lives of ordinary people in a sense. And so there are going to be more and more players entering the space domain. And therefore, they also they also remain extremely worried and concerned about some of the space security developments. The trend of moving away from a pure space militarization, where essentially militaries use space for what used to be called the passive military applications, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and maybe even communications, to active weaponization of space, whether you place weapon in an actual weapon in space or using ground-based missiles to target assets in outer space. Space weaponization trends are seriously becoming a lot more concerning for the developing world, because these countries have just begun to start using space in a big way, whether it is for providing internet connectivity to the world, to their own local population, or to provide telemedicine, especially in the post-COVID pandemic world, telemedicine to remote areas in their respective countries. These are important areas where space is going to be utilized in a big way, or for other developmental purposes and so on and so forth. So for these countries, its utilization of space is not sort of a luxury that it is important. It is important for day-to-day development in a sense. So they are going to be extremely critical in terms of, they also therefore have an interest in seeing what kind of global rules are being written, how they can ensure that their interests are also taken into consideration. That makes it challenging, but I think that's where we also talk about the need for an inclusive platform, inclusive sort of a format involving, it's going to be challenging, it's going to be difficult to develop consensus involving a large number of countries, but at the same time, if you develop any sort of a global rules of the road with the involvement of a large number of countries, there might be some compromises that you need to make, but at the end of the day, you do have a sufficiently large number of countries being party to it, being part of the process, that gives them a sense of inclusiveness in a sense. Therefore, it builds in better compliance and a better insurance of ensuring that they do abide by the rules of the road that they have actually taken part in sort of developing. So I think the Global South has an important sort of a role to play in using space, but also in terms of developing the rules of the road to space utilization. And I think in that sense, when you look at it, I think any rules of the road that is going to be developed, the technology sharing of technology and benefits is a key aspect, at least from the Global South perspective in a sense. And I think that's becoming more and more relevant in all of the global conversations, whether it is a GG or the open-ended working group deliberations and other places. So Global South, of course, has a big role to play.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, I think oftentimes when we talk about, the role the Global South plays, people get stuck on, what they think, should be their role responsibility. But just pointing out, the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, that is the international organization that deals with orbital slots, the geostationary orbit, and deals with spectrum stuff. The Global South is a huge voting bloc there. They have a tremendous amount of power there. And so I think oftentimes we in the West forget that, but Global South sure should not.
Thank you very much. So time is coming to the end, but I think I can pick up one of the last question. So last question is, so what would you understand as a new space economy, and how would they characterize its evolution in the future? So what will be the future of new economy or new space economy? I think the definition of the new space economy varies, but I think it's a role of new space actors and new space services. What will be the future of how do you see it? I think I can start with Nobu.
Yeah, I think that's what I already explained to you. So with both private money, public money comes in the space industry in a more healthier competition, lower down the cost, more new application has to benefit the economy on the Earth. And then investor get return, and then more money flows into the space. So that's kind of a good cycle in the new economy from my definition.
Right. Yeah. So it should be having a sort of an ecosystem that people can be, let's say, bankable. The space activities is not for the not monetized, but it is money. It's bankable. The banks can lend the money so that the companies can pay back with revenue. And I think,
correct. Bankability for the new the company is the key. Yeah, it's like a proof of the new economy.
Yeah. So building up this new market and the new customers and the new revenue stream, these are one of the key issue for the sustainability of the new space economy. Any other comments from Raji? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think sort of a public-private sector partnership model is kind of emerging, even in countries countries like India, for instance. The state-centered space program was being run for a very long time by the India Civil Space Organization, Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO. But I think ISRO has also come to recognize, or the Indian government broadly has come to recognize, that if India has to step up, one, I think there is a growing demand. The demand, whether it is for communication, whether it is military communication or civil communication, the sort of a weather prediction, agriculture, in the agriculture sector, telemedicine, teleeducation, whole range of things. The demand on space is increasing, but the ISRO itself, for instance, not able to cater to the growing set of demands. So there is a compulsion-driven sort of a new approach that has come about, where I think ISRO is now beginning to work with a lot of private sector, whether some of them are startups that are like led by 25-year-olds, but they have the drive, they have the push, and some of them are putting their own personal funds to kind of get the process started. But in recent years, I think ISRO has been very, very has a changed approach, moving from somewhat sort of a wariness to sort of a hand-holding the startups. So 2 years ago, for instance, you had the Skyroot launching their first private rocket by ISRO, and this was again, Skyroot had wholehearted support coming from ISRO in terms of verifying the technical capabilities, technological feasibility, and so on and so forth. Similarly, just a couple of weeks ago, you had the Agnikul, one of the other startup based in India, southern India again, coming up with developing a rocket engine made from 3D printing. So India is beginning to seize the moment in that sense, that there is a huge amount of talent available outside. And if you use them, you can actually step up your own competitiveness. And I think India is stepping up competitiveness for two things. One is commercially driven sort of a goal, which is to capture a large chunk of the global commercial space market that is available there. So India wants to play a competitive role there. And especially India's strength lies in the launch of smaller payloads with its PSLV, Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle program. So in a sense, getting a fair share of the global space market, commercial space market, is one sort of a goal. The second being India's own set of growing space security related threats, and therefore stepping up the competitiveness in that regard. So I think both of them continue to drive and sort of make space for private actors, whether it is new space startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, or the big corporations like the Godrej, Walsnagar, L&T, and so on and so forth, which have also been an active player in the space domain.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, I think oftentimes when you hear people like, oh, there's going to be a space economy worth $1 trillion, what exactly is a space company? What is a space actor? I think oftentimes when people talk about new space and the new space economy, they think solely, okay, you have to launch a satellite, or you need to do something in space, manufacturing, servicing, things of that nature. But really, I mean, what we're seeing the explosion is the application of space data. And I think that's a real turning point. That's going to be a huge change in terms of how, you can use the information. It used to be the only people that could use space imagery, for example, were governments that paid for it and paid all the money. And now anyone who has credit card can buy stuff off the internet, look at commercial images, and that's going to be a huge change, I think, for the future for all the people of the world. Thanks.
Right. Thank you very much for the excellent discussion. I think we have explored a lot of aspects of the space activities of the day, and I think the viewers have get an impression that the space world is changing, and I think there are a lot of things not only in the commercial field but also the security and the international governance field. There are a lot of changes which takes place, but also it has a certain reflection of the current geopolitical competition. It's also very difficult because space is not isolated from what happened on the ground. So I think we need to build up something based on this very complex world, but also space has a uniqueness that the space, the way in which that the things move around the orbit and what you can do in space are quite different from the ordinary activities on the ground. So I think space remains a very interesting field, and the success of the SpaceX and various other commercial activities also gives a lot of flavor of space activities in this age. So I think this only 1 hour and 15 minutes discussion was not enough to explore everything, but I think we touched upon a lot of interesting issue, and I thank all the panelists for providing your excellent knowledge and expertise, and from a different perspective. I think it was a very useful discussion. Finally, please, if you are watching Nikkei channel or YouTube live, please scroll down to the link to fill out your satisfaction survey. We appreciate your input to help improve our series. And thank you for the organization of this webinar by Nikkei and the government of Japan for doing this wonderful sets of interview. So from me, I think it was a pleasure to host this webinar, and I thank you very much for all the panelists. And please give a hand. Unfortunately, we are not able to see it, but please give a lot of hand for electronically or otherwise to these 3 great panelists. Thank you very much, and see you next session. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.